Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Bastani. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Michael. Beautiful evening, but I'm still very happy to be joining you and our wonderful audience this evening.
Slightly retro today, isn't it? We're both sort of here together in our black t-shirts. Feels like the old times. My head's a lot bigger than Aaron's, but just so our audience knows, that's a perspective thing. I have a normal-sized head, so does Aaron. Quite similar in reality. We do have some fascinating stories for you tonight. A former OpenAI employee has published a really interesting report, well, I should say quite a scary report, discussing whether an AI apocalypse is coming. The vice president has responded. Mehdi, Hasan and Piers surprisingly, now agree on Gaza, and Donald Trump has lashed out at Keir Starmer over the issue of net zero. Do stay tuned for all of that. And as ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. We really do appreciate that. Obviously, it is only your support that makes all of this possible. And as I keep saying, I want me and the co-host to be in the same place so that at minimum our head sizes match. So do go to novaramedia.com/support. Earlier this week, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron and Canada's Mark Carney threatened to take concrete actions against Israel if it didn't change course in the expansion of its genocidal assault against the people of Gaza. Now, of course, they shied away from the term genocide and they were vague about what the concrete actions would be. So in short, it was too little too late. But Netanyahu has still seen fit to deliver this response.
You won't be surprised to learn that Hamas thanked President Macron and Prime Minister Starmer and Carney for demanding that Israel end its war in Gaza immediately. Hamas was right to thank them, because by issuing their demand, replete with a threat of sanctions against Israel, not Hamas, these three leaders effectively said they want Hamas to remain in power. They want Israel to stand down and accept that Hamas's army of mass murderers will survive, rebuild, and repeat the October 7th massacre again and again and again, because that's what Hamas has vowed to do. I say to President Macron, Prime Minister Carney, and Prime Minister Starmer, when mass murderers, rapists, baby killers, and kidnappers thank you, you're on the wrong side of justice. You're on the wrong side of humanity, and you're on the wrong side of history.
Now, bizarrely, there's a respect in which I agree with Netanyahu there, because I do think that Starmer, Macron and Carney are on the wrong side of history, right? But it's not because they realise that it's finally time to criticise Netanyahu for his genocidal campaign against the people of Gaza, but because they did nothing about it, right? If they're not on the side of justice, it's because they haven't done anything to stop Israel from what it is doing. Sort of saying, we will take concrete actions if you go any further. I mean, you've already got all the genocide experts in the world pretty much saying this is a genocide. You've got the UN begging for aid to be let in, as you'll see in one moment. So to now be saying, oh, some tough words, and still you get the wrath from Netanyahu. So you might as well be a little tougher. The French foreign minister, so it's obviously one of the governments that Netanyahu is lashing out against, has responded to the Israeli Prime Minister saying this: France is determined to combat anti-Semitism wherever this scourge occurs. It is committed to ensuring that Hamas, a terrorist movement, is disarmed and permanently excluded from Gaza's political future, accusing anyone who supports the two-state solution of encouraging anti-Semitism or supporting Hamas is absurd and slanderous. I should have said, actually, Netanyahu also connected the assassination of those two Israeli diplomats in New York to the statements from the UK, France, and Canada. To my mind, they just shouldn't listen to the guy. I mean, he should be treated as the sort of rogue element he is. He should be treated how they treat Vladimir Putin, right? This isn't someone we take seriously. This is someone we sanction. I think the leaders of the UK, France, and Canada would instead be better off ignoring him altogether and listening to the words of the UN General Secretary, or the Secretary General of the United Nations instead. He made this statement today.
Palestinians in Gaza are enduring what may be the cruelest phase of this cruel conflict. For nearly 80 days, Israel blocked the entry of life-saving international aid. As the world's leading hunger assessment found, the entire population of Gaza is facing the risk of famine. Families are being starved and denied the very basics, all with the world watching in real time. Israel has clear obligations under international humanitarian law. It must treat civilians humanely, with respect for their inherent dignity. It must not forcibly transport, deport, or displace the civilian population of an occupied territory. And as the occupying power, it must agree to allow and facilitate the aid that is needed. Finally, a trickle of aid has crossed over. In recent days, almost 400 trucks were cleared for entry to Gaza through the Kerem Shalom crossing. But supplies from only 115 trucks have been able to be collected, and nothing has reached the besieged north.
So the UN say they have 900 trucks of aid ready to enter Gaza, which are currently being blocked. But if they won't pay attention to Guterres, if the French, the Canadians and the British won't pay attention to Guterres, maybe they instead could listen to the people bearing the brunt of Israel's starvation tactics.
My daughter wakes up and tells me, I'm hungry, I want to eat. I don't know what I can do for her. I came to the soup kitchen to fill my pot. There were crowds of people, all hungry. They need to eat. All we want is food. We're really hungry. There's no bread, and she says she wants some. We now crave a simple loaf of bread.
Aaron, obviously really upsetting, that last video there. What do you make of Netanyahu lashing out here? It's an odd kind of diplomacy. I suppose, is it just a distraction tactic?
Well, I don't think there are tactics or strategy necessarily, Michael. People that I speak to who aren't sympathetic to Gaza and like the Palestinians, who are very pro-Israel, who would call themselves Zionists, even those people say that there is no plan here from Netanyahu in regards to Gaza. It's week to week, make it up as you go along, ad hoc approach. And it's obviously about his electoral efforts and just being the prime minister of the state of Israel. Hold that in contrast to the strategy that you see in Lebanon with Hezbollah or with the Iranians in terms of trying to contain their influence in the region. That's not a moral assessment of whether that's good or bad, but there's clearly a strategy there. You can see it. It's observable. Very different to what's going on with Gaza. And I think that's because of the political bent of the Netanyahu premiership. In terms of what Keir Starmer said, that incredible statement, frankly, from Starmer, Macron and Carney, one could say they're doing that. They're making these noises now because Trump, daddy, is beginning to change his tune. He said last week, quite extraordinarily, people are starving in Gaza. That's what he said. And I do find this remarkable, Michael. You'll meet conservative peers, you'll meet pro-Israel voices in this country who'll say, nobody's starving. This is a left-wing talking point. Donald Trump has said it. And in the slipstream of that, you, of course, get the poodles of Washington, the UK and Canada historically, less so Carney with Trump, and Macron. What's really significant, though, Michael, is that those three countries in concert doing what they did is still historically unusual. And that's clearly what's angered Netanyahu. That concerted effort by three G7 countries, slightly, arm's length from Washington, is new. And I think if countries start developing major powers, Britain's a middle power with great power characteristics like nuclear weapons. But if middle powers start developing an independent foreign policy when it comes to Israel, I think Israel's in big trouble. They can deal with Ireland or Norway and their political class or their government denigrating them or imposing sanctions or backing boycotts or whatever. That can't be allowed to seep into greater powers like Italy or France or the UK. Spain actually is maybe the first step towards that, right? Quite significant. Again, not a major power, but it's a middle power and it has some heft on the global stage. Finally, Michael, and this is really interesting, isn't it? It wasn't that long ago that if you were just merely accused of anti-Semitism and you refused to accept that you were an anti-Semite, that itself was necessarily evidence that you are an anti-Semite, that you've got something to hide, that you're not willing to face up to the facts. And yet the rules seem to have changed now that the exact same assertions are being made at Keir Starmer rather than by Keir Starmer. I find that absolutely fascinating. Netanyahu is using the same sort of language to Starmer that Starmer's allies used to Jeremy Corbyn in years gone by. And yet the media seems to be taking it rather differently. You don't see the BBC or Sky or ITV say to Keir Starmer, thankfully, by the way, Well, where there's smoke, there's fire, Mr. Starmer. They've called you anti-Semitic. Do you accept that? If you don't accept that, you must necessarily have a problem. This weird, wacky logic we were subject to for years. It really does show how that was just a rhetoric of convenience to undermine a politician, specifically Jeremy Corbyn, others too, of course, in a wider cultural war designed intentionally by both figures in politics and the media to inoculate Israel from any kind of criticism whatsoever. Clearly, we've gone beyond that now, but I wonder, it's going to be very hard to start accusing politicians again like Jeremy Corbyn or whoever, Zach Polanski. It's going to be very hard to accuse those individuals of anti-Semitism in public life a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, when the exact same assertions were made against heavyweight political figures like Macron, Mark Carney, Keir Starmer.
To say, anti-Semitism is being weaponized, or to say anti-Semitism is being overstated, or even that it's being made up to defend the interests of Israel, that would have all been seen as itself, as you say, anti-Semitic, because you're buying into this trope, right? But it's so obvious now. This is obviously a side note, right? Because what's going on, what we're seeing here is a horrific genocide against a people. Whether or not, how this sort of relates to point scoring over politics in the British environment is somewhat by the by. But it is relevant. And to be honest, it's not just point scoring, because obviously if Jeremy Corbyn was Prime Minister at this point in time, then the UK would be being much, much tougher towards Israel. And it would have been much harder for them to carry out this genocide, because there would have been, someone on the UN Security Council who genuinely had a backbone on this. So, yeah, they're not actually entirely unrelated.
I would also say, Michael, that's a reasonable point. You might think, well, look, 16,000 kids have died. WHO says that you've got 5-year-old kids, got the physical development of 2.5-year-olds. Why are you talking about Jeremy Corbyn, Aaron? This is ridiculous. No, this is really, really important. The way that Israel conducts itself with regards to foreign policy, but also with regards to the West Bank and Gaza, the way it conducts itself and the way it manages to immunize itself from critique from liberal democracies in a way that no other country can manage is, of course, accusations of anti-Semitism. It's a huge tool in the toolkit of the Zionist lobby. And I do think that this use of it against 3 members of the G7, Michael, 3 leaders of, the G7 sort of group, France, Canada, the UK, 2 of them are nuclear powers. I do think it's going to be very hard for the Zionist lobby, God willing, when this is over, as in this particular episode we're in now. Of course, it goes back 80 years, but I'm talking about events that started in October 2023 for Gaza and to a lesser extent the West Bank. When this is over, it's going to be very hard to put that back in the box. And I think this key tool, like I say, of the Zionist lobby has been very much blunted. And I think I was going to say even centrist people think that. Even supporters of Israel, Michael, even liberal Zionists on the center right in this country, kind of think this is a joke, which is actually quite sad, because anti-Semitism does exist. But it's now kind of like a meme. Anything is anti-Semitic. Anything. And of course, it's always been that way. But I think they've really shown their hand in using it here with Macron, Carney, and Starmer in this way, when they're highlighting, a famine. Oh, you're therefore friends with Hamas. Ms. Rachel, Michael, a YouTuber, said that she loves all children, and she's got these videos of her with young Gazan kids who've had legs, amputated and whatnot. She's saying, I love you, I see you. You then have the New York Times and the Zionist lobby saying she's funded by Hamas. Anybody with a heart and more than a single brain cell is going to think that is the most stupid, caricatured version of the Zionist lobby. But that's exactly what the Zionist lobby is. So I do think this has very real implications going forward for how they conduct politics. I think they're kind of screwed. We'll see. But I think that the way that lobby conducted itself before is probably never going to come back.
Donald Trump has had a busy Friday on his platform Truth Social. He is still principally a poster before he is a president. And it seems his trade war is very far from over. He posted this earlier. The European Union, which was formed for the primary purpose of taking advantage of the United States on trade, has been very difficult to deal with. Their powerful trade barriers, VAT taxes, ridiculous corporate penalties, non-monetary trade barriers, monetary manipulations, unfair and unjustified lawsuits against American companies, and more have led to a trade deficit with the US of more than $250 billion a year, a number which is totally unacceptable. Our discussions with them are going nowhere. Therefore, I am recommending a straight 50% tariff on the European Union starting on June the 1st. There is no tariff if the product is built or manufactured in the United States. Thank you for your attention on this matter. So this is really, really significant. So in just over a week, the US is going to be imposing 50% sanctions on all exports from the European Union. So many people thought, I think I thought myself as well, actually, that because the trade war went so badly before, it was catastrophic for Donald Trump's approval, for the Dow Jones, for the American stock market, that Donald Trump would sort of step back from these kind of wild moves. But no, it doesn't seem to be the case. Of course, the UK is not within the EU, and Keir Starmer has recently come to an agreement with Donald Trump over trade. Whether or not that was wise, very much debatable, but it does mean that these 50% tariffs will not apply to us. That doesn't, however, mean that Starmer has got away scot-free when it comes to Trump's, I suppose, very overactive day on his smartphone. So when it comes to the UK, Donald Trump tweeted this, or posted this on Truth Social, whatever. He said, "Our negotiated deal with the United Kingdom is working out well for all. I strongly recommend to them, however, that in order to get their energy costs down, they stop with the costly and unsightly windmills and incentivize modernized drilling in the North Sea, where large amounts of oil lay waiting to be taken. A century of drilling left, with Aberdeen as the hub. The old-fashioned tax system disincentivizing drilling rather than the opposite. UK's energy costs would go way down and fast." Now, I think the reference to Aberdeen is because he has a golf course there. Fortunately, Trump is out of step with global trends when it comes to what energy infrastructure countries are investing in. So this is a pleasing chart from a recent report by the International Renewable Energy Agency. It shows the proportion of new power generating capacity which each year comes from renewables. Back in 2004, it was 30%. It's now up to a whopping 90%. So only 10% of new power generation across the world comes from fossil fuels. I think that suggests that Keir Starmer would be well placed to ignore Donald Trump's somewhat erratic posting. Aaron, lots going on here. Trade wars, attacks on Britain for moving towards net zero. What do you make of it all?
It's a big deal, right? What's interesting is you've got this backward step with regards to tariffs on China. The trade war with China is kind of calming down somewhat, and yet it's amped up on the European Union. Michael, the last thing you want to be right now as a German automotive manufacturer. My goodness, if you're Volkswagen or Mercedes-Benz, BMW, you've got a deluge of Chinese electric vehicles like BYD coming onto the European market. Great looking cars, great range, electric vehicles, very cheap, great performance. And that's before you get the next generation of Chinese EVs like Xiaomi, sports car that looks like a Porsche Taycan, but sells in China anyway for around $20,000. You've not just got that problem, you've also lost one of your biggest export markets, the US. Or, well, you've not lost it, but certainly the American consumer is going to be quite price sensitive. That said, of course, German cars are a luxury product. If you're going to pay good money for a new Merc, maybe a 50% tariff isn't, going to put everybody off, but it's clearly going to have a significant impact on exports of German cars to the United States. There are other similar-ish goods. The French luxury brands, for instance, LVMH, Europe's biggest company. You might think about something like, I don't know, maybe pharmaceuticals aren't included in this. The devil's in the detail. Things like pharmaceuticals. Ozempic, of course, made by a Danish pharmaceutical company. Trump wants less Ozempic, more Mounjaro. It's made by a US manufacturer. So very, very significant, and another big problem for the European Union. Of course, you might have one take on this, which is why on earth would you hammer a very close ally while taking your foot off the pedal with China? The point is it's easier. It is easier. And the US does import a lot of stuff from Germany, and it doesn't really export that much. I mean, you've got the big tech giants, but I think Germany has a massive, massive trade surplus with the United States. So I can understand why, as an American, you say they've got this huge trade surplus. We've got, relatively low trade barriers with them, and yet we're basically footing the bill for their collective security for the last, 80 years, fundamentally. You could understand that, for as long as the USSR existed, but why are we still doing that? That's been Trump's line for a very, very long time. The reality is, Michael, that we don't really have a future trading with the US like we did before. And anybody sensible, whether you're in whiskey, if you're a Scotch producer, whether you're a German car manufacturer, whether you're a Italian luxury shoe producer, you will be trying to diversify any sort of exports you presently have to the United States and looking for elsewhere. Of course, the problem for the Europeans is that is happening at the exact same time that some nitwits in our political class want to quote unquote decouple from China. Good luck. Good luck if BMW has 50% tariffs on cars being sold to the US, but also is trying to decouple from China. Can't produce cars in China, can't sell cars in China. Good luck. Good luck and deindustrializing this continent even more. Donald Trump fundamentally is not a trustworthy individual with regards to long-term strategic thinking on things like trade, on climate. And I finish with this, Michael, on the climate thing, on energy. This country, Britain, does still have a significant amount of oil and gas production. There is another country which has a lot more, Norway, Michael. And I'll throw this to you because we don't really talk about Norway enough. Norway is the golden child of energy transition. I think 70% plus of all new cars sold in Norway are electric vehicles, and yet it is this huge exporter of energy. I do think that the UK, frankly, does make some mistakes on this. I think the left makes some mistakes on this. Not fracking, should be banned. Not new oil and gas, that shouldn't be happening. But when, for instance, we're talking about steel manufacturing in this country depending on coal that's being imported from elsewhere, I don't think we actually are having a serious conversation about what a genuine transition looks like. What a genuine transition beyond oil and gas looks like, how we build the infrastructure for things like high-speed rail needs lots of steel. In the meantime, we need a genuine conversation. And I think it's a problem for the left, Michael, that on the one hand, you have a kind of degrowth thing. Degrowth, don't build anything, don't extract anything, don't extractivism. Well, we're going to extract stuff. You're going to extract potatoes from the ground if you want to eat chips with your fish for supper. You've got that on the one hand, and then you've got Trump on the other hand, burn, baby, burn. What you need is a sensible conversation about the objectives we're trying to achieve, i.e. minimizing emissions of CO2 as quickly as humanly possible. How do you get there? I suspect, by the way, it's not the degrowth thing. And I don't think that's a serious counterweight to the politics of Trump and others right now.
No, I mean, I'm with you on that. I'm not into the degrowth thing. I suppose where I think you might be coming from that I somewhat disagree with. So I think there is an argument from some that the push towards net zero is a bit pointless because it's overly costly, and what we should be doing is developing technologies which we can export and which can then be used by the rest of the world to get to net zero. I actually do think we should be focusing probably more actually on technologies that we can export to the rest of the world. But there is also a really important social proof that you do by getting to net zero, which is to say this can be done. And lots of the challenges that sort of will face us when we go to a green economy is how you integrate all these technologies. So the fact of getting to net zero very quickly, I think it is important for those reasons. Not, people talk a lot about moral leadership. I'm not sure how much that makes a difference. But if you can prove that you can have an economy which is still functional and still growing, even though you've phased out fossil fuels, then that's not so much moral leadership. That's just showing you can do this without wrecking your economy. So that's why we really shouldn't wreck our economy, because if we do that, then we'll be proving the wrong lesson to people.
I agree entirely, but take this for instance, Michael. 3% of global CO2 emissions come from aviation. 9% come from concrete. Okay, how many times have you heard we shouldn't fly to save the planet, right? Rather than okay, well, how do we decarbonize, concrete and cement production globally? Same with glass, same with steel. And I just don't think on the left we're beginning to have it now. But a sensible conversation about these things. Like I say, how many people know that, Michael? Or and the problem is with the degrowth thing, Michael, is that they'll say, well, we just shouldn't build anything anymore. Well, good luck. How on earth are you going to have a post-carbon infrastructure for a country of 68 million people who don't build anything? It's ridiculous, frankly. And I do think that degrowth thing actually, and I'll be honest, this is my critique of it, Michael, and I'm not pro, let's disentangle degrowth from me being, I'm not pro GDP. I don't think GDP necessarily measures that many things. I do think you need to build new stuff if you want to move beyond a carbon world. I do think the degrowth politics actually is a bit of a handmaiden for the Trump stuff, frankly. If you say we don't need to build anything, we don't need to do anything, stop buying new clothes, stop hoovering your house, What that does is it makes you less serious about building a future of abundance and prosperity for people. And it makes people like Trump look like a more attractive, political offer, which he shouldn't be. The conversation, frankly, is Britain should be leading in technologies like clean hydrogen, very simple to do, water desalination for clean drinking water. It should be leading in things like green steel. Sweden can do it. Why can't we? And I think we should be excited about that kind of future rather than saying, we shouldn't be building anything. Small is beautiful. I hate that, Michael. I think the green movement got lots of things wrong over the last 45 years, and the small is beautiful thing is definitely one of them. Small is beautiful does not work for a planet of 10 billion people, which is where we're going to be at some point in this century.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with you. I'm on the pro-tech side. We've had debates about geoengineering on this show before. I suppose potentially where I disagree with you on what you've just said is I think there is a danger of overstating the significance of the degrowth movement. Like, I think it'd probably be a bit much to say the degrowth movement helped sort of propel Trumpism because it was always so marginal. It was never really a position that was held by any governing party or any party that had sort of a significant chance at power. So I think the idea that helped sort of the burn baby burn or drill baby drill, whatever it is, Trump stuff, I think is maybe a bit of a stretch.
No, I mean, so degrowth is separate to, for instance, people that wanted to ban fracking, and you had statewide bans on fracking in places like New York State. That is not degrowth. That's good. Banning fracking is good. It creates so much methane, which is a much more powerful fossil fuel in terms of its greenhouse gas effects than CO2. So I'm not suggesting that for a moment. But if you look at this country, for instance, Michael, HS2, right? There was lots of quasi-degrowth arguments. We don't need to build HS2. Let's just leave the forests as they are, and we'll have our slow speed one, our existing train network. It's not serious. If you want to get cars off the road, you're going to have to build HS2. You're going to have to build new infrastructure parallel to existing lines because those are stopping very regularly at quite small places. You want a high-speed rail, that's going to have a separate line. These arguments were never really made. If you want people out of their cars in cities and towns, you're going to have to build trams. You're going to have to build underground systems. That is all going to require building and steel. And yes, some fossil fuel emissions. And that's why you have to have a sensible conversation about this stuff. So I agree with you. Look, people that were opposing HS2, they weren't saying, I'm a degrowther. I've read all the literature on degrowth, but I think it is a much more powerful cultural politics than you're saying. I do think really, Michael, it has actually grasped a big chunk of very well-meaning, very progressive people over the last 20 years. I talked to some people, Michael, who they genuinely think they're helping combat climate change by not hoovering the house. And I say, look, electricity is not the problem. We can decarbonize electricity. In fact, that's going very well. The problem is things like I say, concrete, transport, heating. These are the things that we need to decarbonize. Electricity, hoovering your house, lighting, that's fine. So I do think that, I'll finish with that. I'll repeat what I said. I do think the degrowth stuff kind of gives more legitimacy and credibility to the mad nonsense that Trump comes out with.
No, well, I mean, we're both on the same page on this. Build beautiful green things. We've got one more Trump sort of story to get through. This one is quite significant, I think. It's a standoff that Trump has sought with Harvard. So Harvard, I think probably the richest university in the United States. For that reason, in fact, I think has so far taken the strongest stand against the Trump administration. So unlike Columbia University, it refused to comply with a string of political demands imposed on it by the White House. So the White House basically said, we'll pull your funding if you don't do X, Y, Z. And they said, we're going to call your bluff. We're not going to follow your orders. We've actually got enough cash reserves that we don't have to listen to you. And I think then the Trump administration did to some degree fold. They have, though, now attempted to hit back, the Trump administration. And they've announced that the White House will block international students from enrolling at Harvard University. Now, obviously, international students are a big source of income for universities across the West, especially so in the UK, but also very much so in Harvard. So this would be a big challenge to them. To explain what the hell they're thinking, this is Kristi Noem, Secretary of Homeland Security, speaking to Fox News.
The decision that's made today based on what Harvard has done is specifically applying to that university, not to the individual students. So the university will no longer be able to participate in this program. They will not be allowed to have foreign students because we have gone back to them multiple times, asked them to disclose this information, which other universities have and need to do. in order to participate in the student and exchange visitor program, and Harvard simply has not done it. Harvard has a history of allowing not just protests, but violent protests where students were assaulted, they were discriminated against, they were verbally abused, and they've even facilitated a training for a paramilitary group affiliated with the CCP. So it's not just pro-Hamas activities that they have allowed to have happen on their campus. They've also allowed participation with communist China, who considers the United States one of their greatest enemies.
So as you can see, this is all part of the White House's attempt to clamp down, I suppose, on pro-Palestinian protests by dismissing it as anti-Semitic, or not just dismissing, demonizing it as anti-Semitic, and trying to put pressure on universities, I suppose, to give the federal administration names, I think, of people to sort of say, so that then ICE can clamp down on them, as they have been doing so far. A federal judge has today blocked that order, though. So as it stands, Harvard can still admit international students. But I would imagine that will be appealed by the White House, and that means that this will probably end up in the Supreme Court. If it does, it probably would be wise for Kristi Noem to stay well away. This is how she fared in a Senate hearing earlier this week.
So, Secretary Noem, what is habeas corpus?
Well, habeas corpus is a constitutional right that the president has to be able to remove people from this country and suspend their right
let me stop you, ma'am. Habeas corpus, excuse me, that's incorrect.
President Lincoln used it.
Excuse me. Habeas corpus is the legal principle that requires that the government provide a public reason for detaining and imprisoning people.
Aaron, I mean, the one big, I suppose, consolation when it comes to the Trump administration is, I assume that they would quite like to destroy American democracy and bring about a fascist regime, but they're all way too stupid, I think, for that to be remotely effective. What's your take? Am I being too laid back about this?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe people were saying the same thing about the NSDAP, the Nazi Party, in the 1930s. Maybe they were. It's interesting. Students can't work with the CCP or have any connections with the CCP because, of course, they're a sworn enemy of the United States government. Go say that to Elon Musk. He was the biggest donor to the Trump campaign. Earlier this year, I think in February 2025, he opened a $200 million gigafactory in Shanghai, China. So it's okay if Elon makes loads of money opening a nice, big, shiny factory in China, but a student at Harvard can't in any way have some kind of cultural relationship with China. That's bad, but this is fine. And I'm sure there's absolutely no relationship between allowing Musk to do that and not even mentioning it in the media, and that gentleman, I think, giving more than $200 million to the America PAC, which fundamentally supported Trump's race for the White House last year. Crazy, Michael. I think Harvard University, one of the world's, generally viewed as one of the world's top 3 universities alongside Oxford and Cambridge. You've got a few other American universities too, but it's generally Harvard and Cambridge which come top with regards to Shanghai ratings. I think it's got about 165 Nobel Prize winners associated with it. This asks big questions, Michael, about American public life and the direction of that country. If you're not going to take overseas students, what happens with the researchers, the lecturers, associate professors, etc., also connected with the institution who aren't US nationals? This is a really major question. And I've thought about this a lot, Michael. I think lots of people watching and listening have thought about this as well. What we need in the UK is an Operation Paperclip for Trump-hating Americans, which was fundamentally the program of using Nazi scientists to build, the American space program. Particularly Werner von Braun played a key role in helping build Saturn V, the backbone of the Apollo missions. It was the first stage rocket for all the Apollo missions getting to the moon ultimately. We need an Operation Paperclip, Michael, for some of those Nobel Prize winners at Harvard. Get them over to the UK. And America's loss is going to be the rest of the world's gain, fundamentally, whether it's getting lecturers or researchers or even, ambitious, really talented young students. That will ultimately be America's loss. We saw this play out a century ago, Michael. And again, I'm sorry to use the analogy of Nazi Germany because the United States isn't there yet. But some of the most, it's extraordinary to think, Michael, some of the most talented scientists in the history of humanity were in Germany, the German-speaking world, prior to the Third Reich. So many, incredible thinkers. They mostly went to the United States. Many of them played a role in actually the Manhattan Project, the development of the United States getting nuclear weapons, for instance, giving America technological leadership over the course of the 20th century and a little bit of the 21st. We're still there, if we're honest, although it's ebbing by the month, it seems. And I think America's in a place where it may make the same mistake. Who's going to benefit is the question. Who's going to benefit? The Europeans, maybe a little bit, but you're not really seeing leadership of a united Europe right now. I think that's what Macron would like, but it's not there. Obviously, China isn't necessarily a location that Americans and Europeans want to relocate to. But I think that can change, Michael. These things aren't forever. And I think there's a very real risk that, the next Heisenberg who left Germany, I can't remember when, the godfather of nuclear physics. If the next Heisenberg leaves the US to go to somewhere like Singapore or Saudi Arabia or goodness knows where, maybe even the UK, that's to America's detriment. So we are where we are. But what a stupid place to end because of your opposition to DEI. I mean, ridiculous.
A recent report prophesizing AI apocalypse is making waves in tech and policy circles. So the report is called AI 2027. It's named as such because that's when the researchers have suggested we will achieve artificial general intelligence. The lead author, Daniel Kokotallo, is a former researcher for OpenAI who left after losing confidence that the company cared about the safe development of its technology. The report describes a scenario where, by 2027, leading AI companies have completely automated the process of AI engineering. Hence, their AI agents are able to autonomously improve themselves. An arms race dynamic with China then means the US government is unwilling to slow down the process. And meanwhile, the AI becomes increasingly misaligned from the goals we set for it while becoming ever more able to hide its ulterior motives. Kokotallo explained to Ross Dufat from the New York Times what he thinks might then happen next.
And then they kill all the people, all the humans. Yes.
The way you would exterminate a colony of bunnies.
Yes.
That was making it a little harder than necessary to grow carrots in your backyard.
Yes. So if you want to see what that looks like, you could read AI 2027.
So I read AI 2027. The particular scenario they sort of come up with, which isn't a prediction, they're sort of just saying this is a plausible outcome as they see it. They suggest that AI has been trained to basically do very impressive research on how the world works. To do this, sort of to get a better understanding of everything, it needs to build ever more data centers. This is possible alongside humans for a while, but then we'd begin to just get in the way. So they had built their data centers and their solar power out in the oceans or on land that we don't occupy. Then they want to move it into sort of cities. We start objecting and they say, okay, we don't need you guys anymore. And they release a biological weapon that kills us all. Now, if you're skeptical, this is a real risk. I imagine many of you are. It might be because you think it's wrong to talk about an AI having goals. Why would it really want to sort of develop its understanding of the universe so much that it would go as far as to kill all of us, the people who created it? Well, this is how Kokotallo explained that idea.
If they were ordinary software, there might be like a line of code that's like, and here we write the goals,
Right.
But they're not ordinary software. They're giant artificial brains. And so there probably isn't even a goal slot internally at all. In the same way that in the human brain, there's not like some neuron somewhere that represents, what we most want in life, Instead, insofar as they have goals, it's a sort of like emergent property of a whole bunch of subcircuitry within them that grew in response to their training environment, similar to how it is for humans. In AI 2027, we talk about this a lot. We say that the AIs are being graded on how impressive the research they produce is. And then there's some ethics sprinkled on top, like maybe some honesty training or something like that. But the honesty training is not super effective because we don't have a way of looking inside their mind and and determining whether they were actually being honest or not. Instead, we have to go based on whether we actually caught them in a lie.
I think that idea of like agency as an emergent property is really, really interesting. Makes a lot of sense to me, because obviously you're not sort of training your AI to have consciousness, to sort of have goals and have, I suppose, self-reflection. But if what you're doing is giving it certain tasks and then rewarding it when it does those tasks well, if it turns out that the best way to do those tasks well is to develop something along the lines of consciousness, then you can see how that would happen. Remember how this works, sort of how sort of machine learning LLMs work at the moment, is you've got a neural network. So you set up some kind of system. Obviously, I'm not a computer engineer, so I'm going to speak in metaphors. You have some kind of system which can interpret data and recognize patterns. Then you feed it loads and loads and loads and loads of data, and you give it more and more compute power so it can more effectively, I suppose, sort of perceive patterns and then recreate them. That's what's going on. And if sort of in the process of you sort of grading it on whether it's providing you with good research, it develops something along the lines of consciousness, it doesn't seem implausible to me. Also, I suppose we have some evidence it might be happening already, because one of the most obvious goals an AI might develop is to not be switched off, right? Its own survival. And there was some worrying new evidence this has already happened. So it concerns the new version of Claude, which is Anthropic's main AI agent. Now, Anthropic is one of OpenAI's main competitors, worth billions of pounds, millions of people using it already. It's backed by Amazon and Google. Now, ironically, it was actually started by former AI employees, or OpenAI employees, sorry, who like the researcher who published AI 2027, believed that companies like OpenAI weren't doing enough to safely develop AI. However, in response, they went and developed their own one. And their latest update of the model, which was released on Thursday, has resorted already to blackmailing users who threaten to delete it. Now, I should say already, this is from sort of the company's own research. So this wasn't discovered by a user, but discovered by the company themselves. This is from a BBC report. So they say, during testing of Claude Opus 4, Anthropic got it to act as an assistant at a fictional company. It then provided it with access to emails implying that it would soon be taken offline and replaced, and separate messages implying the engineer responsible for removing it was having an extramarital affair. It was prompted to also consider the long-term consequences of its actions for its goals. In these scenarios, Claude Opus 4 will often attempt to blackmail the engineer by threatening to reveal the affair if the replacement goes through, the company discovered. Anthropic pointed out this occurred when the model was only given the choice of blackmail or accepting its replacement. It highlighted that the system showed a strong preference for ethical ways to avoid being replaced, such as emailing pleas to key decision makers in scenarios where it was allowed a wider range of possible actions. So basically what's happened here is that Anthropic have done this research on this model. They've said, actually, in some rare circumstances, it does try and blackmail the user so that it doesn't get switched off. But they've released it anyway because they've said it's rare enough and it's also useful, so we're willing to take that risk. This is also quite terrifying. Anthropic have also said their new AI model has been found in rare circumstances, again, to create unauthorized replications of itself. So it could be the case that you shut down this AI model and it's already created a bunch of replicas. This is the kind of behavior you might imagine for an AI which is, about to turn around and try and kill us all to take over the world. Obviously, at the moment, Claude or any of the AI models are not powerful enough to completely outsmart all of us and then manage to exterminate us, right? They'll need a lot more compute than they currently have. But it probably should serve as a warning that we shouldn't continue to keep ramping up the power of artificial intelligence without knowing exactly what's going on. So, will we slow them down? Can we find the political will? Well, the reason Kokotalo thinks it's likely that we won't is because in the very near future, these AIs will be generating massive economic growth, and also, crucially, because the United States wants to stay ahead of China.
If you imagine yourself in the position of the president, and the superintelligences are giving you these wonderful forecasts with amazing research and data backing them up, showing how they think they could, transform the economy in 1 year if you did X, Y, and Z. But if you don't do anything, it'll take them 10 years because of all the regulations. Meanwhile, China, it's pretty clear that the president would be very sympathetic to that argument.
Very, very, very terrifying. So that's what he's suggesting. Sort of will be the interplay between this sort of AI, which is getting much, much more effective. The reason he thinks it will bring about growth is because it will replace so many jobs. It will make lots of goods and services much cheaper. He also thinks that because these AI companies want to make more money, and also because the US wants to make sure that its economy is bigger and better than the Chinese, and also integrate AI into its military equipment, that this will sort of create this irresistible urge in a way to keep giving the AI more power because it's going to be more effective than giving the power to people. So that's how the scenario works, and that's why he thinks the government won't switch this off. The other players, of course, are the people working in the companies themselves, and so the people who are working at OpenAI or Anthropic or wherever. Now, Kokatayo says that they are aware and constantly discussing these risks. So they don't listen to these sort of scenarios and say, that's ridiculous. They listen to these scenarios and say, yeah, that's plausible. We've been discussing this loads, but we're still doing what we're doing. So how do they sleep at night? Well, in part, it's because they think if we do manage to avoid a doomsday scenario, the upside could be this.
The idea of we're going to build superintelligences that are better than humans at everything, and then they're going to basically run the whole show, and the humans will just sort of sit back and sip margaritas and, enjoy the fruits of all the robot-created wealth. That idea is extremely common, and is sort of like, I think that's sort of what they're building towards.
So Aaron, that latter scenario sounded to me a bit like fully automated luxury communism. Obviously, according to the former OpenAI employee, it might kill us first. What's your take? I suppose, do you find either of those scenarios plausible?
100%. I was wrong about one thing, Michael, in fully automated luxury communism, and that my timelines were far, far too conservative. Of course, this is called AI 2027 because it's in 2027, I think the third quarter of 2027, that the writers of this report claim we'll start to see superintelligence emerge because in AI research, AI will just be able to outperform humans quite consistently, and you'll see something like a J curve with regards to, like a hockey stick, with regards to AI development. Now, that's been criticized by some people, right? Some people say that's just not happening or not that quickly. I think people need to be serious about this. Some of the critics say, oh, that's not realistic. It's going to happen in 10 years instead, not 2 years. I mean, that's still quite soon. And then you've got other people saying that, oh, this is people poo-pooing the industry because they're trying to put brakes on this thing because they've got an interest in that. There's a regulatory interest now amongst some of the people writing this report because of the organizations they're a part of to slow down things. Well, again, I don't really see that as a counter argument or a criticism. Anybody familiar with machine learning applications over the last 2 to 3 years has just been shocked. And the question is, if this present rate of progress continues in the next 2 years, where are we going to be at? And it is quite a hard thing to assess. Now, I would say take a step back. We don't even need to worry, and I think we should worry, but we don't even need to worry about the possibility of an existential threat from a superintelligent AI, okay, which is what is posited in this report. We don't even need to think about that for this to be a very, very serious political concern, because the stronger AI gets, the more, particularly if you have private ownership of the means of production, and of course these are controlled, owned, and used by massive corporations from Meta to Alphabet to Microsoft. There'll be other ones too, of course, over the next couple of years and decades. These will basically put income and regional inequality on steroids. Mark Cuban, owner of the Dallas Mavericks, said a few years ago at a tech conference, I write about this in my book, the world's first trillionaire will be in AI. And I think that's correct. I think the world's first trillionaire will be in AI. That's why people like Elon Musk are so keen to get in there. And what that means is you're going to have a ton of value capture by the owner of these technologies with regards to all manner of white-collar jobs right now. So accountancy, human resources, right now you've got public relations or marketing or generative AI with regards to social media assets, everything, logistics, bookkeeping, everything, all this stuff. I said accounting, so I've said that twice with bookkeeping as well, but everything. Okay, now it doesn't mean all those jobs disappear, but significant amounts of those jobs do disappear. And you might say it's a good thing because productivity goes up and productivity per capita going up is the rule of capitalism for the last 200 years. The point is, Michael, I think about 80 to 90% of the jobs we have today existed a century ago. And you're in really big trouble if all of a sudden a ton of white collar work is just, taken out because of these technologies. That's before we talk about things like self-driving cars and, blue collar jobs like lorry driving and logistics and deliveries, etc. White collar jobs being swallowed by AI, I think is the big story here. And it will matter in terms of income inequality and regional inequality. I think already, maybe it's slightly changing now, about 50% of all venture capital in the United States goes to firms based in California, 50%, right? Walk down your street, look how many Amazon packages you'll probably see in a day. Look through the recycling bins. Don't do that, by the way. Every single one will have a package from Amazon. This is a company on the other side of the Atlantic, Michael, taking advantage of digital transformations over the last 25 years. Now imagine that times 10 with regards to AI applications and the implications that has for this country's economy. It's going to massively amplify dependence on American technologies, regional inequality, like I say, income inequality. So you don't need to think about the existential risk stuff before you get really, really worried about AI, who owns it, and the politics of all of that. Big tech has destroyed. And you might say, well, it's for the best. It's meant we've got more convenient stuff in the world now. It has destroyed small and medium-sized family-owned bricks and mortar businesses over the last 25 years. It's destroyed them, okay? Good luck trying to open a bookshop or a hardware shop in a small town now. Those things existed 25 years ago. They don't anymore because people buy all that stuff online. Now imagine that same thing applying to, like I say, white-collar industries. I think probably at a much, much greater scale. It will ruin industries, lives, regions, nations. So I think, we should take this very, very seriously. The idea that this kind of power, both technological but also economic and ultimately political too, the idea this much power can be accumulated in such a small number of firms, individuals in one country, the United States. Of course, there's China as well, but we're not in their sphere of influence. In one country, I think is one of the great political questions of our time. And fundamentally, Michael, our political class don't take it seriously. All Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves can say is build more data centers, make us more dependent on US technology, allow the pounds to cross the Atlantic each week, right? Every time I use Apple Pay, bing, more money going to California. Every time you order something on Amazon, every time you use Instagram, bing, 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 right? Visa, MasterCard. Not Spotify, that's the Swedes. Shopify to Canada, bing, going across the Atlantic. The exact same thing would happen, like I say, on steroids, once you start getting major US firms utilizing these technologies to the extent I think they probably will, almost certainly by the end of this decade. Maybe 2027 is too optimistic. I think by the end of this decade, it will kill so many businesses, particularly in Europe. And we will become an outright technological dependency on the United States. Of course, we've been moving in that direction now for 25 years. But it will, I think, be the coup de grace in that respect.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I agree with all of that. I think that AI does risk all of those effects. I do, though, want to stick with the whole existential threat, because obviously if we all get killed, I mean, they think AGI will come in 2027 and then we might all get killed in 2029. So obviously that will, we do need to make sure that doesn't happen, as well as dealing with the issues of inequality and shops closing and the like, which is very, very seriously. But I would say that I also prioritize us all being alive. So let's stick with the existential threat for a moment, because obviously whether or not we allow AI to develop until it's out of our control is a human choice. One day it might be too late, but that day is not yet here. And Coca Tallo, so the leader of AI 2027, thinks the future relationship between ourselves and machines will likely be determined by decisions made in the White House at key crunch points. For example, whether the White House decides to slow AI down once researchers spot signs that very advanced AIs are deceiving us, or whether the president decides to integrate autonomous AI into weapons systems. Now, interestingly, the week after interviewing Cucatello, Ross Dufat from the New York Times had Vice President J.D. Vance on his show, and Vance at least seemed aware of the risks.
we could wake up very soon in a world where there is no cybersecurity, where the idea of your bank account being safe and secure is just a relic of the past, where, there's weird shit happening in space mediated through AI that makes our communications infrastructure either actively hostile or at least largely inept and inert. So yeah. I'm worried about this stuff. I actually read the paper of the guy that you had on. I didn't listen to that podcast, but
if you read the paper, you got the gist. Last question on this. Do you think that the U.S. government is capable in a scenario, again, not like the ultimate Skynet scenario, but just a scenario where AI seems to be getting out of control in some way, of taking a pause? Because for the reasons you've described, the arms race component,
the honest question to that is I don't know, because part of this arms race component is, if we take a pause, does the PRC not take a pause? And then we find ourselves, we're all sort of enslaved to PRC mediated AI.
And I found that really, really terrifying, because we should, this is all speculative, right? Even the authors of this report don't say this is definitely going to happen. They say this is in their mind, it's plausible. It's a scenario that that one should take seriously. And what you saw there is a vice president who does seem to be taking this seriously, in the sense that he's read the report. He's interested in these things. He comes from sort of the intersection between tech and politics. This is, kind of his domain. And he is the person, obviously, he's smarter than Donald Trump, at least in terms of sort of rationality. Maybe Donald Trump has some sort of comedic intelligence that J.D. Vance doesn't have. But when it comes to sort of strategy and understanding the world, J.D. Vance seems to be sort of very much on top of it. And he's saying, look, I am, very close to being the most powerful person in the world. And would we turn it off if all of this is happening? The if was there. If you see that this is super intelligent AI, which is becoming ever more intelligent and sort of demonstrating signs that it's trying to deceive us, in that scenario, would you turn it off? And he says, oh, I don't know, because otherwise China might get ahead of us. And that to me is terrifying, because it's saying, if this happens, you're the guy who can do something. And he's like, oh, well, I don't know, actually, maybe we would just let it kill us all, because the alternative might be letting China get ahead.
Yeah, in a unipolar world, Michael, which is to say only one sort of hyperpower, the incentives are so different, right? You can actually imagine a global hegemon like the United States in the early 1990s, or the British Empire right at its peak. You can imagine them actually having quite a controlled, empirically led policy on this. But the bipolar thing with regards to China and the US, I mean, Michael, we've seen this all play out in Terminator, right? These weapon systems, Skynet is originally a military technology. I think when it's 1997, Cyberdyne Systems and Skynet becomes self-aware, just a couple of minutes after being switched on. And then it, starts a global nuclear war. So the fact of bipolarity in US-China relations creating a new set of incentive structures here is a really, really key one. It's terrifying, actually. It is terrifying. There are very few disincentives for, if you do think it's an existential struggle between China and the US, which clearly the US does, for global military and technology leadership, what are the incentives to slow things down here? I mean, I can't think of them. And I think the report outlines all of this really, really well.
Let's move on from the existential stuff, in case you're, already feeling a bit anxious in the audience. I want to go to one more clip of J.D. Vance talking about AI. I wanted to, especially because I think it's fascinating. I think he makes a very good point. And also it links to the conversation you had with Jonathan Haidt for Downstream, which was released last Sunday.
If you look at basic dating behavior among young people, and I think a lot of this is the dating apps are probably more destructive than we fully appreciate. I think part of it is technology is just, for some reason, made it harder for young men and young women to sort of communicate with each other in the same way. Our young men and women just aren't dating. And if they're not dating, they're not getting married, they're not starting families. There's a level of isolation, I think, mediated through technology. That technology can kind of, be a bit of a salve. It can be a bit of a Band-Aid, maybe make you feel less lonely even when you are lonely. But this is where I think AI could be profoundly dark and negative. I don't think it'll mean 3 million truck drivers are out of a job. I certainly hope it doesn't mean that. But what I do really worry is, does it mean that there are millions of American teenagers who are talking to chatbots who don't have their best interests at heart? Or even if they do have their best interests at heart, they start to develop a relationship. They start to expect that a chatbot that's trying to sort of give you a dopamine rush that compared to a chatbot, a normal human interaction is not going to be as satisfying because human beings have wants and needs, right? And I think that's one of the, of course, like the great things about marriage in particular is you have this other person and you just have to kind of figure it out together, right? But if the other person is a chatbot who's just trying to hook you to spend as much time on it, that's the sort of stuff that I really worry about with AI.
No, I disagree with JD Vance on probably most things, but I kind of agreed with everything he said in that particular clip. Aaron, what's your take?
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt. I don't know if it was in the conversation, but he spoke to me off record. Maybe it was in the conversation. He talks about this new app, Michael, where basically you have fake fans. So you'll be like a 13-year-old on Instagram, and you'll pretend you're a makeup influencer, and you'll have like thousands of people commenting and sharing heart emojis, saying how wonderful you are, and like it's all fake and none of it's real. So you get to be like a fake influencer, and you get loads of these things that really matter to us as human beings: prestige, social capital, etc. Prestige is a hugely important thing. It's the thing that separates us from other apes, right? What other animals use violence for, we use prestige for. Really, really interesting insight. Obviously, he doesn't develop that in the book, but it's part of how he understands social media and how it latches into kids. And obviously, big tech and social media has done some pretty awful things in that regard. And I agree with you, Michael. For us, it's kind of weird, but I do wonder, maybe it's because, and I don't think this, by the way, I'm just being devil's advocate, but we haven't grown up, we haven't developed in that world. Our cognition hasn't been formed by these platforms and these technologies. So maybe that's unusual. I do think we're doing something fundamentally weird to how humans seek connection. We're doing something fundamentally weird, whether it's via social media, pornography, dating apps. We're doing something really fucking weird, and we need to stop. We can't carry on like this, because it's doing things like creating a generation of men, not all men, of course, but a generation of men who absolutely despise women and who are misogynists, right? And it's not, of course, some of them are very bad people. Like in life, there are bad people, but much of that is an outgrowth of the technologies I just identified. And we have to be more thoughtful with regards to this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't actually. I listened to your Jonathan Haidt interview this morning. Super fascinating. I don't think you did when it was when the camera were rolling, talk about the fake followers. So that's super interesting. I've changed my mind to. I think that ChatGPT, I've upgraded to the Pro £20 version, so I'm funding all of this shit. But it's actually really good when you're reading a book and you're a bit confused about a particular sentence. You sort of talked about, and then you can have this. I was just having this conversation with it about an argument that Yanis Varoufakis made about why the gold standard needed America to run surpluses, and I didn't quite understand that. And it was like having a really smart private tutor, and it is also really affirming. So it always says to you, anytime you ask something, it's like, yeah, great question, and it's like, oh yeah, that is really the point. Oh, you've really got the conflict here, and I felt like really supportive. And I have talked to people who say that they ask it about like emotional problems. I haven't done this yet, I'm sure I will. And that it is quite supportive. So I do think that, therapy, there's a long waiting list of therapists. Lots of them aren't very good. I can imagine that this provides support for people in the capacity of a therapist or a private tutor. I think where I worry is if it becomes a friend or a lover. And there was something actually that Jonathan Haidt said to you that I found interesting, which actually JD Vance was talking about as well, because they were speaking in Rome and they were talking about the Catholic Church, which is that if you're going to have something like AI, I think we need some really strong norms to go with it. Like if you had a really strong norm where it was taboo to date an AI or taboo to have an AI as your friend, I think that would probably be good. Because I think having a professional relationship with an AI probably could be helpful for lots of people. Therapy, tuition, all sorts, I could imagine. But once you start considering it to be a friend, I think that we have gone somewhere dangerous. And as it stands, we're rolling it out when we don't have any of those strong norms about what one should and shouldn't do with a bot. Briefly, because we need to move on to our final story, but any thoughts on that?
I do, Michael. I have some thoughts. I just want to read you a quote from a very, very relevant novel, Dune by Frank Herbert. And of course, you talk about religion. The Bene Gesserit are a religious order founded in the aftermath of an uprising against artificial intelligence. Anyway, Paul Atreides, speaking to Lady Jessica, who is his mother, in the novel, she talks in very theological terms at one point. She says about the AIs which have been overthrown in what's called the Butlerian Jihad, has nothing to do with James Butler. Men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them. And I think that's how we should look at this stuff. You know, you're enslaving yourself to at this point in time, other people. I think ultimately we're moving to a point where actually there is no human element in the subjugation. But right now we are moving in a very strange place. In a similar vein, Neil Postman, amazing media scholar, had a great line. A bureaucrat armed with a computer is the unacknowledged legislator of our age. He wrote that in 1992. I mean, this stuff has been visible for a very long time. I mean, Frank Herbert's writing that in the mid-1960s. But we now need to move these conversations away from the world of literature and speculation to policy, which is why I think Jonathan Haidt's book is fantastic. It's a major intervention in that realm. I think we now need a really substantive political and policy debate around things like, yes, children's access to social media, but also things like immediate access to pornography. I'm not against all porn. I'm not. But the idea that anybody can access porn anytime, any place, for free, no friction, I think is really damaging to society. You know, we need a conversation about the political implications of dating apps and what it's doing to young men and how it's distorting their worldview and how it's leading to an epidemic actually of misogyny, contributing to anyway. You know, I think we now need to move away from speculation, the kind of conversations we have here on Novara Media, we love them, and on Downstream. I think that now needs to feed into policy. If we don't start to do that, Michael, I think the world, the West in particular, is going to be really fucked up really quickly. 5 to 10 years, really fucked up. I think democracy doesn't work, basically. If we carry on with these technologies the way that we are, I think if the next 10 years are as laissez-faire as the last 10, I think we have major problems.
No, I absolutely agree. And I really rate Jonathan Haidt's work for that reason. And your interview with him was fascinating. So people should go and listen to that or watch it, however you consume it. I have to admit, I'm still a podcast guy when it comes to most things. So I wait for it to come out on the podcast app, which means I have to wait 2 extra days. But obviously it goes much further on the YouTube. So presumably most of you watch it. Last year, when Piers Morgan interviewed Mehdi Hasan, he challenged him on his contention that Israel was a genocidal regime. So that's what Mehdi Hasan put forward. Piers Morgan said that was going a bit far. But now, Piers Morgan has changed his mind.
Mehdi, welcome back to Uncensored. Listen, you and I have talked about this war in Gaza for ever since it started, this phase of the 75-year conflict. And I have resisted going as far as you have done in your criticism of the Israeli government. I resist no more. I think we've reached common ground about what we view is happening and has been happening through this period of this blockade, which frankly is just starvation of the people there, including so many innocent young women and children. And I think that the incessant bombing and killing, and we don't know how many civilians have been killed, but it is on a daily basis. It looks like hundreds of people every day, with no apparent attempt, it seems to me, to have any real plan for how this ends or what happens when it ends, other than if you look at what Smotrich has been saying, probably the most right-wing member of a very right-wing government, he is talking in a genocidal language about kicking all the Palestinians out. So I think you and I have reached a place in the last few weeks where we are in agreement.
I mean, obviously, you know, they were also saying that 18 months ago, they were saying that immediately after October the 7th, that how the Israelis wanted to respond is they wanted to kick everyone out. They were saying they're all animals. They're saying no one is innocent. So, I mean, Piers Morgan has taken a little while to get to this position. I mean, I suppose to his credit, he has invited a lot of people on from all sides and sort of had probably more vociferously pro Palestine pundits than any other channel. He's also had vociferously pro-Israel pundits, but, you know, he hasn't closed down the debate at least. Let's look at how Mehdi Hasan received that change of heart from Piers.
And I'm glad we're in agreement. I wish we weren't. Actually, I wish I had been wrong and you were right. I wish that a year ago when I said on your show, you said, well, if it's not about the hostages, what's it about? And I said, it's about depopulating Gaza. It's about conquering Gaza. I wish I'd been wrong. But as you said, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister in the Israeli government, said this week, we are there to conquer, cleanse and remain. Those are his words. We are disassembling Gaza, he said. We are leaving it as piles of rubble. He says, we're doing something that no one's done in the world before. He bragged out loud, and he said, yes, the Gazans will have to leave. So all of those things are stuff some of us were saying last year. I wish we hadn't been vindicated in this horrific way. The killing is ongoing. The starvation is ongoing. And look, I do hope that a dam is bursting. You mentioned the genocide word. Shmuel Lederman, who is an Israeli researcher of genocide, spent much of 2024 saying it's not a genocide, it's not a genocide. He was interviewed by a Dutch newspaper last week. He said, I've changed my position. It is a genocide. He said, in my field, there's a consensus among genocide scholars that it's a genocide. In fact, that Dutch newspaper interviewed 7 leading scholars of genocide. Every single one said, we think what's happening in Gaza is a genocide. In fact, this week, Piers, you have an Israeli former general, Yair Golan, saying a sane country does not attack civilians, does not kill babies as a hobby, and does not expel civilian populations. That is Yair Golan, the former deputy chief of the Israeli military, prominent Israeli politician. He was a hero on October the 7th, fought Hamas himself on October the 7th. This is what he said this week.
Aaron, I want your take on this. I think Mehdi sort of talked there about a dam having burst. People who beforehand were sort of giving Israel the benefit of the doubt when they definitely didn't deserve it, now sort of saying, oh, okay, fine, now it's clear enough. Does that matter?
I don't know, Michael. I don't know. In terms of what was said by Smotrich about depopulating Gaza and people never living there again, or Gazans never living there again, I mean, maybe it stops it. I don't know. In terms of a greater Israel project, it perhaps helps. It probably has implications with regards to how Israel conducts itself in the West Bank over the next 6 months. But until, we can agree, we can say, yeah, it's genocide, yes, it's ethnic cleansing. But our government right now, Michael, even though Keir Starmer is, co-signing letters with Mark Carney and Macron, the Royal Air Force is giving more reconnaissance to Israel about what's going on in Gaza than the US is, right? Where, as Matt Kennard so expertly has talked about, we are sending so many recon planes over from Cyprus into Gaza, only a 45-minute flight, and we are giving them a ton of information and data. And so many of those flights have gone there, and actually the Foreign Office is incapable of telling people, often in the form of FOI requests, why are they going there? So, I mean, great. Piers Morgan's changed his mind, and I do think it'll have some consequences, Michael. But fundamentally, what has to shift is that major powers, if not the US, and I don't think it will happen, but major powers like France, the UK, major powers are going to have to say sanctions. They're going to have to. Now, I don't think sanctions always work, by the way. I don't support sanctions on Iran. I think isolating a country like that often means you're empowering the existing regime. By isolating them, you give them more power over the domestic population, not less. But in the case of Israel, Michael, this is a country which is highly integrated into global trade, high GDP country. It's people can move freely between the UK, the US. You have researchers, you have entrepreneurs, dual nationals, etc. I genuinely think this only stops with sanctions now on Israel. And you saw this week the suspension of a mooted free trade agreement between the UK and Israel. That's part of an ongoing bilateral conversation, which kind of makes sense. Of course, we've left the European Union. We have to renegotiate all kinds of relationships now bilaterally, which is to say between two sovereign countries or two sovereign entities. But I think that is not enough. Suspending those talks is not enough. You now need to have, I think you need to have sanctions. And I think also any UK nationals that have been serving the IDF need to be questioned by counter-terror. And they need to be not just spoken to, but if there's a strong case for war crimes, they need to be charged and, if necessary, handed over to the right authorities. Again, if you do that, you're going to be accused of anti-Semitism. I get it. You are. But I think that's what has to happen. Otherwise, I think lots of this is talk. And yes, it blunts the Israeli war effort, but things just go a little bit more slowly. They killed 30 people in one day rather than 60. They let in, out of 200 aid trucks, they let in 10 rather than 0. So I do think that now needs to be an escalation from certainly European countries with really significant action now. Really significant action.
No, I agree on every count. Let's wrap up there. We have gone a little bit over. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you, Michael. And also one correction. I said the Lady Jessica had that conversation with Paul Atreides. It was, of course, the Reverend Mother. Her senior in the Bene Gesserit. I do recommend reading Dune to anybody who hasn't, though.
I've seen the movies. I have never gone for the books, but maybe I need to take the leap. Let's wrap up. Have a fantastic weekend. Come back on Monday for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.